History is often remembered through the names of kings and emperors, but the true soul of history lives in the moments when ordinary people stand against impossible odds. The Battle of Falkirk in 1298 was one such moment, where the fate of Scotland was decided not by crowns or palaces, but on a wide open field soaked with fear, determination, and blood. This was not merely a clash between two armies. It was a struggle between domination and freedom, between imperial ambition and a nation's right to exist. Before we go deeper into this powerful historical documentary, if you are someone who enjoys deep, well-researched stories of real wars, forgotten heroes, and turning points of history, make sure to subscribe to the channel. These stories are not just meant to be watched, they are meant to be remembered. By the late 13th century, Scotland was a kingdom in crisis. The death of King Alexander III in 1286, followed by the tragic loss of his granddaughter and heir Margaret, known as the Maid of Norway, left the Scottish throne empty. This absence of leadership created political chaos. Scottish nobles were divided, each faction pushing its own candidate for the crown, while the common people suffered under uncertainty. Into this fragile situation stepped Edward I of England, a man feared across Europe for his military skill, iron discipline, and ruthless ambition. Edward I, later known as Longshanks, was not interested in simply advising Scotland, he wanted control. Using Scotland's internal divisions to his advantage, Edward forced Scottish nobles to recognize him as their feudal overlord. Many submitted, believing resistance to be pointless against England's immense power. In doing so, Scotland slowly lost its independence without a full-scale war, becoming a nation ruled by fear rather than consent. However, oppression always breeds resistance. English rule in Scotland was harsh and humiliating. Heavy taxes were imposed, English officials replaced local authority, and justice became a tool of occupation rather than fairness. For the ordinary Scottish people, life became a daily reminder of lost freedom. It was within this environment that a man named William Wallace emerged, not as a king, not as a noble lord, but as a symbol of rebellion. William Wallace's early life remains partly hidden by history and legend, but what is clear is that he understood the pain of occupation. According to traditional accounts, Wallace's personal tragedy at the hands of English soldiers became the spark that pushed him toward open rebellion. Whether driven by personal loss or national outrage, Wallace chose a path that few dared to walk. He began attacking English outposts using surprise and speed, avoiding open battles and striking where the enemy least expected. What started as small acts of resistance soon grew into a nationwide uprising. Scottish fighters rallied behind Wallace, drawn not by promises of wealth, but by the idea of freedom. The rebellion reached its first major success in 1297 at the Battle of Stirling Bridge. Against a larger and better equipped English army, Wallace and fellow leader Andrew Moray used terrain and timing to devastating effect. English knights were trapped while crossing a narrow bridge and were slaughtered as they fell into the river below. The victory shocked England and echoed across Europe. Following Stirling Bridge, William Wallace was knighted and named Guardian of Scotland. For the first time, Scotland felt hope. Yet victory brought new challenges. Wallace was a soldier, not a politician. Scottish nobles remained divided, some openly supporting him, while others secretly negotiated with England to protect their own interests. Scotland lacked resources, money, and professional soldiers. The English navy controlled the seas, cutting off vital supplies. Wallace knew that Edward I would not tolerate defeat and would return with overwhelming force. In 1298, Edward Longshanks personally led a massive invasion of Scotland. This time, there would be no underestimation. Edward assembled one of the most powerful armies of the medieval world, including heavily armored knights, disciplined infantry, and the feared Welsh longbowmen, archers whose weapons could pierce armor from deadly distances. As Edward marched north, the land suffered terribly. Villages were burned, crops destroyed, and starvation was used as a weapon to weaken resistance. Wallace understood that avoiding battle forever was impossible. The English advance forced him into confrontation near Falkirk, an area of open ground that heavily favored Edward's cavalry. Despite the disadvantage, Wallace prepared his army with the best strategy available. His men, mostly spearmen with little armor, formed tight defensive circles known as schiltrons. These formations were designed to stop cavalry charges, turning massed spears into walls of death. Scottish archers were positioned between these formations, while the hope of a nation rested on discipline and courage. On the morning of July 22nd, 1298, both armies faced each other on the field of Falkirk. Mist hung in the air as banners fluttered in the wind. Wallace's army was outnumbered and outmatched, yet they stood firm. These were farmers, laborers, and villagers, men who had everything to lose and nothing to surrender. Across the field stood Edward I, confident that this day would end the Scottish rebellion forever. The stage was set. The silence before battle was heavy, broken only by the sound of marching feet and distant commands. What followed would become one of the most important and tragic battles in Scottish history. As the morning mist slowly lifted over the fields near Falkirk on July 22nd, 1298, the reality of the coming clash became impossible to ignore. Edward I's army stood vast and disciplined, its banners stretching across the horizon, while the Scottish force under William Wallace appeared smaller, rougher, and visibly less equipped. Yet numbers alone did not decide medieval battles. Morale, positioning, and leadership mattered just as much, and Wallace knew this was the moment upon which Scotland's survival depended. Wallace placed his trust in the Chiltern formations, dense circles of spearmen trained to resist cavalry charges. Each man stood shoulder to shoulder, long spears angled outward, forming a living fortress of sharpened wood and iron. Against charging knights, these formations could be devastating, as horses would refuse to impale themselves on the forest of spear points. Wallace's strategy was defensive by necessity, designed to neutralize England's greatest strength, its heavy cavalry. Scottish archers were positioned between the Chilterns, intended to provide covering fire and disrupt any English advance. Edward I, observing the Scottish formations, was momentarily cautious. He had learned from previous failures not to rush blindly into resistance. However, confidence soon replaced hesitation. Edward understood that while the Chilterns were strong against cavalry, they were vulnerable to one weapon in particular, the longbow. The Welsh archers under Edward's command were among the most feared soldiers in Europe, capable of firing arrows with deadly speed, range, and penetration. The battle began with English cavalry attempting to probe the Scottish lines. As expected, the Chilterns held firm. Horses reared and screamed, knights fell, and for a brief moment it appeared that Wallace's strategy might succeed. The Scottish spearmen maintained discipline, their formation unbroken, their determination fueled by the knowledge that retreat meant annihilation. This early resistance gave the Scots a surge of hope, a belief that once again they might defy the impossible. Edward quickly adjusted his tactics. Rather than waste knights against the Chilterns, he ordered his longbowmen forward. What followed marked a turning point not just in the battle, but in the history of warfare itself. Waves of arrows darkened the sky, raining down upon the tightly packed Scottish formations. The spearmen, locked in place to maintain defense against cavalry, had little room to maneuver. Shields were few, armor was light, and panic slowly began to spread. As arrows pierced flesh and wood alike, the Chilterns began to weaken. Men fell, leaving gaps in the formations. The Scottish archers, poorly protected and outnumbered, were unable to counter the longbowmen effectively and were soon overwhelmed. With the Chilterns disrupted, Edward seized the moment. He unleashed his cavalry once more, charging into the broken Scottish lines with devastating force. At this critical moment, the final blow to Wallace's army came not from England, but from Scotland itself. Many Scottish nobles, who had brought cavalry to the field, chose not to fully commit to the battle. Some withdrew early, while others fled entirely, unwilling to risk their lives or estates for a cause they believed already lost. This betrayal shattered any remaining chance of victory. Wallace's infantry, now exposed and unsupported, faced slaughter. The battlefield descended into chaos. Scottish soldiers fought desperately, but discipline collapsed under relentless attack. The ground became soaked with blood, and the sounds of battle gave way to screams and confusion. Wallace, realizing the battle was lost, was forced to retreat with what remained of his forces. Survival, not victory, became the only objective. The Battle of Falkirk ended in a decisive English victory. Thousands of Scots lay dead, while Edward's losses, though significant, were acceptable by the standards of medieval warfare. Militarily, Falkirk was a disaster for Scotland. Politically, it was a severe blow to Wallace's leadership. Though he escaped the battlefield, his authority as Guardian of Scotland was irreparably damaged. In the aftermath, William Wallace resigned as Guardian. He understood that Scotland needed new leadership, someone who could unite the nobles and continue resistance through different means. Wallace did not abandon the cause, however. He faded into the shadows, continuing to fight through guerrilla tactics and seeking foreign support, including appeals to France and the papacy. His role shifted from commander to symbol, a living reminder that Scotland had not surrendered. Edward I, though victorious, did not achieve the peace he desired. Scotland did not submit quietly. Resistance continued under new leaders, most notably Robert the Bruce, who would later rise to become Scotland's king. Falkirk taught the Scots painful lessons about warfare, unity, and the dangers of internal division. It also revealed weaknesses in Edward's strategy, showing that brute force alone could not extinguish a nation's desire for freedom. Historically, the Battle of Falkirk is remembered not as the end of Scottish resistance, but as a necessary failure. It demonstrated the brutal efficiency of the longbow, reshaped medieval battlefield tactics, and exposed the cost of noble disunity. Most importantly, it transformed William Wallace from a victorious commander into a martyr-like figure whose sacrifice inspired future generations. Wallace's eventual capture and execution in 1305 only strengthened his legacy. Rather than destroying the rebellion, Edward created a legend. Wallace became a symbol of defiance, courage, and national identity, a man who dared to stand against an empire when submission would have been easier. In the years that followed, Scotland would rise again. Robert the Bruce would learn from Falkirk's mistakes and achieve victory at Bannockburn in 1314, securing Scottish independence for a generation. In this sense, Falkirk was not a defeat without meaning. It was a painful chapter in a longer story of survival. The Battle of Falkirk reminds us that history is not shaped solely by victories. Sometimes it is forged in loss, sacrifice, and the refusal to give up. Scotland may have fallen on that field in 1298, but its spirit did not break. It endured, carried forward by those who believed that freedom was worth any price.